I was rereading the Declaration of Independence in preparation for today, and I thought it was interesting that with respect to King George III, the Founding Fathers expressed frustration that he is affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. That felt like a kind of familiar accusation. Later on, they fume at him. They say, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury. Shortly before that, they anger that he has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. Maybe the Trump administration comes to mind with respect to some of these accusations. But it's important to note that a lot of these accusations aren't very new or stranger to us in 2026 today. After 9/11 preventionary policy, George Bush faced criticism being called King George IV. Nixon, after Watergate, faced protest in the form of pins reading "No More Kings." Trump famously suffering the same just last year. Franklin Roosevelt, after the New Deal, was frequently called King Franklin. Abraham Lincoln was facetiously referred to by opponents as King Abraham I. Calling presidents kings is kind of no new thing to us as Americans, and it was kind of strange to me to see that while we've come a long way since 1776, the spirit of those disaffected revolutionaries remains very intimately present in contemporary critical political discourse. When I think about why we call presidents kings, I think that we criticize presidents calling them kings for two reasons. The first is to say that you have too much power. The second is to say that you've been around too long. Interestingly, the Athenians in ancient Athens had a process by which they sort of dealt with this problem. If you look up the word ostracize, the Oxford Language Dictionary will tell you via Google that to ostracize someone is to exclude them from a society or a group. But if you look a little bit further down, it will also tell you the etymology of the word ostracize. The root of the word ostracize being ostrakon, a word in ancient Greek that's very relevant to us today. Ostrakon referred to shards of pottery that were used in an ancient practice called ostracism. The way that it worked was simple. In the 6th month of the 10 months allotted in the calendar year for business, Athenian leaders would go to the people and they would say, is there someone you want to ban from the polls? If you were banned from the polls, you weren't simply rendered ineligible for election, you were also banned from the city of Athens for 10 years. Your property was seized, you were immediately expelled, and if you tried to come back before the 10 years were up, you were set to be executed. It was a very big deal. So in the 6th month of the 10 months allotted in the calendar year, the Athenians would be tasked with deciding, do we want to ban someone from the polls? If a majority voted yes, then we move on to step 2 of ostracism. Step 2 is that they bring in leaders from neighboring city-states and nations. They want to keep this impartial. They don't want to leave room for motivated local meddling. And they say, come to a sectioned off area of the agora, a kind of meeting space where they allowed for political discourse and debate. And they said, bring with you pottery shards, bring with you ostrakon. And on the ostrakon, write the name of the person that you want to ban from the polls and ban from the city. If a minimum of 6,000 votes were tallied, something like 15% of the ancient Athenian citizenry, then the ostrakon was considered valid, and the name that appeared the most on the most pottery shards was banned from the polls. After 10 years were up, they were welcome to come back, but often after this experience, few did. Humor me for a moment and imagine if we as Americans tried to adopt that process today. If we, continuing in this tradition of calling presidents kings, fed up with this idea of people who have too much power, sticking around for way too much time, decided that we wanted to try ostracizing political actors from the polls. The first thing we'd do is we'd quickly run out of pottery, right? Maybe we'd take better care of our potters. I think that we'd go feral for this sort of a thing. It would appeal to a very real American retributivist sense. Now, someone may be thinking that we couldn't have this process too late in the political, way that we go about these sorts of things. Banning one person from the polls would be effectively electing another. So we could say, okay, we could take this further back to the primaries. I know tons of people. They don't vote in the primaries because they can't think of a single thing that they particularly love about anyone on the primary stage. But ask them, is there something you hate about at least one person on the stage? And they're probably much more ripe and able to give you a ready answer. Ostracism in the primaries may be an avenue to increase political participation. But maybe someone could also rebut that we could keep this same practice later on down the road. If you knew that by putting all your eggs in one basket, This could be a basket that gets banned at the last second and your opponent gets elected. You may be more willing to fight for more people being on the ballot on election night. You may be more interested in departing from a two-party system, and ostracism at the last moment might increase political participation while also functioning as a kind of pushback to the kind of two-party system that in many ways all of us suffer from today. I don't feel very passionate about this. I'm being a little bit facetious here, but I think that this is still a very reasonable thing to consider for the purpose that it might tell us something meaningful about the state of our political culture today. It may be that the problem with ostracism isn't that it wouldn't work in today's system, but that it might work almost too well in today's system. It wouldn't just appeal to our spiteful senses, it would motivate us to political action for maybe all the wrong reasons. Media companies scripting our political opinions by selectively feeding us frightening information would give us a ripe foundation to figure out what it is that we hate about the people on the stage without giving us many reasons for why we should prefer the people that we inevitably vote for. To the guiding question of today, what are the challenges that prevent, limit, or undermine the principles of the Declaration of Independence from guiding our constitutional system? I think our system suffers from a kind of apathy that really needs to be addressed. I don't know that we lack for literature or that we lack for effective teaching of the existing literature. I think what we lack is the sense of civic duty that compels people to fly to the polls and to happily engage with our political system. Today and tomorrow, it will be helpful, I think, to reflect on the kinds of motivations that we want to underpin the sort of political participation I imagine that many of us are after. This reflection, I think, will be valuable to us moving towards a more desirable America, cultivating capable interpreters as opposed to writing perfect language. At the end of the day, we can talk as much as we want about the principles, the Declaration of Independence, but the principles have no power in and of themselves, apart from the minds that read these principles, interpret these principles, and aim to affect these principles. Focusing on the listener, the hearer, the interpreter, apart from the bare language, I think offers us a more meaningful path forward to a more desirable America. Thank you.
I think we'll hold for questions until, I think the best way to work this would be about halfway through, we'll stop and have questions for the first group of speakers, and then we'll continue. And I'll limit the number of questions so everyone gets a chance to have their talk. So our next speaker is Sonya Doubledee of Emory University. Let's make sure I can get your PowerPoint. See it on my screen, but for some reason it's disappeared again on where's the PowerPoint?
All right. Hi, I'm Sonya Doubledee, and when I was asked to think about the guiding principles of the Declaration, I thought a lot about rhetoric. And as a policy debater, I really thought about a lot about all the ways that the Declaration is used by political leaders today. And so I want to go over my thesis statement, which argues that we're seeing so many infringements on individual rights and questions of sovereignty that I kind of argued that the Declaration has turned into a rhetorical tool and that its meaning is solely dependent on the speaker and the translator. And so when we talk about rhetorical analysis, in my next slide, I'll be talking about how the speaker is a responder. And so I want to talk about the Declaration's original context. The Declaration is unique in that it had a very specific statement that it was making. There are lines and lines of transgressions that King George III has made, and I argue that this falls in line with Bitzer's discussion of a rhetorical situation where there's a speaker, a very explicit audience, and of course, a problem. And I argue that the Declaration of Independence was in response to a specific problem that is then proposed by the speaker. However, today, when you take the Declaration outside of its original context, how we understand the Declaration is solely dependent on who's translating it to us. And these principles can mean very different things. And today we're seeing the Declaration defend complete opposite sides of political arguments. And so translation turns into an act of creativity, where meaning is not discovered in these situations anymore. Rather, it's created by the person who's speaking. And so I argue that the continual redefinition of the Declaration's underlying principles sort of begs the question of whether this document truly relays a vision that can be followed, or does it simply embolden any desire, given a skilled rhetoric can articulate it. And so I want to look at the contemporary topic of immigration. So specifically, on the conservative side of immigration, they have a lot of different arguments dependent on the Declaration and the Constitution. Scholars have cited the need to disband from Britain and the breaking of these political bans, and they argue that this implies an exclusion of America from others. And so they look at all men are created equal and they say, yes, but there's some sort of value that Americans hold. And so conservative thinkers often use this as a reason to sort of back up immigration restrictions. Additionally, there's this question of a state of laws, where they cite sort of interpretations of the Declaration, cite John Adams' claim that America, one people, are distinct because they are a nation of laws, not men. And so they look at the Declaration and they say, this is a list of soon-to-be laws. There are all of these transgressions listed by King George III, and this is the founding of our country. And so on the next slide, there's a conversation of citizenship and natural rights, where these conservative arguments often point to restricting immigration as an obligation, where the Declaration argues the government's purpose is to secure these rights. And so they argue citizenship is not a natural right, but rather something awarded when certain principles are encapsulated. Conversely, when we look to liberal arguments, they point to this specific transgression of King George III. And you'll see a lot of articles today talking about how the Declaration is pro-immigration. And the reason why is because they argue that King George III was very against the laws for naturalization of foreigners and refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither. And so when we look at contemporary comparisons in the next slide, we'll see that if all men are created equal, why should there be restrictions on immigration at all? What differentiates an American if the rhetorical signal of independence touted these Enlightenment principles of universal equality? Furthermore, when we look at the Trump administration today, we're seeing a lot of comparisons with individuals arguing that current restrictions more closely resemble these British imperial policies that spurred American revolt and independence. However, on the next slide, I talk about how both of these arguments divorce the Declaration from its context, and this can have some serious issues. So first, when we talk about immigration policy, from the beginning, the open-door American immigration policy was only really applicable to Western Europe due to these extensive classifications and restrictions. Racism was also a predominant influencing factor for immigration policy. And so in this way, there is a question of whether the laws were corrupt in and of themselves in 1776. Additionally, when scholars make both of these arguments, they often sort of divorce how the framers understood both of these principles, and that can be really harmful when we look back at history of the United States. And there's almost this recreation of history that happens through the speakers. And so when we translate the Declaration, we can see that it's removed from its original context. Rhetoricians can recreate historical meaning. So what does that mean? There's this vying for legitimacy that you'll see in a lot of these arguments when you talk about contemporary political issues, where there's this unquestionable legitimacy that they're trying to gather from these founding documents. There's this belief that if the true meaning is uncovered, that contemporary political actions will be unquestionable. And you'll see that a lot in these documents where they talk about, would Thomas Jefferson agree? Would John Adams? What are the principles of our country? And do they defend my contemporary political understanding of this issue? And so outside of this original context, the speaker often urges the audience to identify and act against injustice by a contemporary political entity. And so there's this real question of, can these comparisons be made and why? Because I think the principles are really important, but it's important to understand that there's this creation that's happening through the translation. So much time has passed that there needs to be an understanding of the context and an understanding of who is translating the Declaration to you. And so on my conclusions, I argue two different messages. The first is that the Declaration has been divorced from its context in the modern day. So the Declaration has become a rhetorical tool, for good or for bad, able to defend entirely opposing perspectives on contemporary issues, such as immigration. This means that it's unable to encapsulate a true, concrete, guiding principle due to translation by speakers for purely political motives. Second is that we need to acknowledge that the speaker is creating this sort of new history for us when they translate the document outside of declaring independence. And so it is a political document, which is really important. This means that it becomes mutable, and speakers have an unrestrained ability to translate the Declaration to defend completely different political movements. But also, there is real rhetorical power with these founding documents, especially the Declaration, because it's used to create historical significance and legitimacy for a political movement. Thank you.
Next up is Jonathan Duncan from Jacksonville State.
Move this over as well. Hopefully I don't break anything.
If you've ever seen a tree that's been struck by lightning, damaged by a storm, or holding a rope swing, you might notice something remarkable. The tree doesn't simply go back to the way that it was before, but it heals around the wound. The scar becomes a part of the trunk. The tree is permanently changed. And yet, despite the damage, it continues growing upward. There is one thing, however, that a tree cannot survive. If it becomes detached from its roots, it dies. I want to talk about due process as if it were that kind of tree. It has deep roots, it has scars from conflict, it has grown taller over time, and today, one of the strongest winds testing its strength is the question of immigration and how we treat those who are not citizens. Like any tree, it can withstand storms and even grow because of them. But it can only continue to grow if it remains connected to the principles that first gave it life. We often treat due process as something uniquely American, but it goes back more than 8 centuries. In 1215 at Runnymede, English barons forced King John to agree to the Magna Carta. In one of its most famous clauses, the 39th, it declared that no free man could be imprisoned or stripped of rights except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. This idea was extraordinary for its time. It meant that the king himself was not above the law. Power had limits. Authority had to operate through law, not personal will. That was the seed of due process. More than a century later, in 1354, Parliament formally used the phrase due process of law. It expanded protection beyond just free men and declared that no person could be deprived of liberty or property without legal procedure. The idea was becoming more concrete. The seed had sprouted. Centuries after that, during the Glorious Revolution of 1688, Parliament drafted the English Bill of Rights. It prohibited excessive bail, excessive fines, and cruel and unusual punishments. The monarchy was permanently limited. Government power was restrained by clear rules. The tree was growing thicker and stronger. Then the colonists carried with them the acorn of this great tree. Planted in American soil, it grew into something greater than its British predecessor, while still preserving that same nature of growth and resilience. When King George III violated these principles by interfering with colonial governments, holding a standing military in peace, and taxing without consent, the American colonists faced a decision. They could try to restore the old balance under the English Bill of Rights, or they could take the principle even further. They chose to take it further. In the Declaration of Independence, the founders did something radical. They said that rights do not come from the government at all. They come from the Creator. All men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights. In that moment, due process became universal. It was no longer just about how a government treats its subjects. Universal due process reshaped not only the relationship between government and the governed, but also the way citizens understood one another as equals possessing inherent dignity. To understand how significant that shift was, we need to pause and make an important distinction. Before the Declaration, due process was particular. It governed the relationship between the ruler and subject under a political system. After the Declaration, it became universal and substantive. Substantive due process, of course, means that laws must respect those universal rights. A law cannot simply follow the correct procedure. It must also be just in its content. The roots grew deeper. When the Constitution was written, these ideas were given structure. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. The Fifth Amendment ensures that no person is deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. The Sixth guarantees fair trials. The Eighth prohibits cruel and unusual punishments. But it was the 14th Amendment, adopted after the Civil War, that fully extended the promise. It declares that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That word matters. Person, not citizen. Person. The tree had grown tall enough to cast shade over more people than ever before. Still, growth has not been smooth. Like any tree, it has faced storms. One of the most serious modern tests of due process has been immigration. The question is simple but difficult. Does due process truly apply to non-citizens? In the late 19th century, 2 Chinese immigrants running a laundry business in San Francisco were denied permits under a discriminatory law. The Supreme Court held that the 14th Amendment protects all persons within the United States, not just citizens. That decision affirmed that due process does not depend on nationality. Yet the story did not end there. During the Cold War, Ignaz Mezei, a longtime lawful resident, was detained on Ellis Island for 2 years without a hearing. The court upheld that detention. In dissent, Justice Jackson reminded the country of the Magna Carta and the ancient promise that no person should be imprisoned except according to the law. This was a bleeding scar in our tree, and one we have since gone to great lengths to heal. Later decisions would reaffirm that once a person is within the United States, the Due Process Clause applies, regardless of whether their presence is lawful or unlawful. Each of these cases leaves a mark. Each controversy tests whether we are still faithful to the roots of our tradition. Today, we live in the shade of this long legal inheritance. We benefit from protections that began in a meadow in England and were transformed through revolution and constitutional amendment. But we must ask ourselves whether we are still connected to the roots that sustain this growth. A tree heals around its wounds. The scars remain, but they become a part of its strength. Due process has grown in that way, shaped by rebellion, civil war, social change, and judicial conflict. It has reached new heights because it stayed rooted in the idea that human dignity limits government power. But if we forget that principle, if we begin to treat rights as privileges granted only to some, then we risk severing the very roots that keep that tree alive. The question before us is not whether due process has a long history. It clearly does. The question is whether we will continue to nourish it, because like a tree, it can grow taller with each generation, but only if we remember where it began.
I said we would have questions after the first 3 speakers. Does anyone have any questions? If not, I'll try to launch things. Any questions? Dr. Hurdy, Director Matter, excuse me.
Yeah, I really appreciate the presentation. Very thought-provoking. I love connecting the document with contemporary issues, showing it's still very rich food for thought and perhaps something that is or should be continuing to shape our reflection on appropriate actions now and going forward. A question I have for Sonya, if I may, is a question of if the importance of understanding the document within its context is that we're not just taking it and using it for whatever rhetorical purposes we want. I'd be interested in how you would describe a bit more fully how to understand the context so that we could then have a more complete modeling that we could take and apply to other situations.
Yeah, I think the problem.
You stand up as you.
Oh, yeah. Actually, I'm going to go to the front. Hold up. Sorry, my inner extemper. And then also, I think it's really important to understand the rhetorical situation originally so we can apply it. The problem with context, especially when we work at contemporary political issues, is that oftentimes we don't actually acknowledge the original context of the document to be able to apply it. And so I think what really needs to happen is there needs to be an understanding of what these different words meant during its time and how we're carrying those principles to the future, because those principles are going to have changed since 1776. And there needs to be acknowledgement that they have not stayed the same at all. Actually, very similar to the tree metaphor, these grow over time. And so a lot of times when you hear about these principles, they're stated almost as though they were stationary, like we had Enlightenment principles then, all men are created equal, and it meant the same thing then as it does now. And there needs to be acknowledgement that it has not. And there were a lot of issues with the founders in 1776 during the time, and our country has come a long way. And that context needs to be acknowledged when we compare it to sort of these new contemporary issues, especially such as immigration.
So in that regard, it's not an original argument that with the new societies that we're going to act on, we should be guided just after 1980.
Yeah, that's actually perfect. It's instead of guiding, it's an evolution. And so you need to understand where it started, but it isn't guiding us. Rather, we are guiding it, is sort of the argument. Is like our society is guiding where we have come from.
Let me follow up on Dr. Matter's question, press you a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
So if the principles evolve, the meaning evolves, why do speakers keep going back to the source? Because it seems to be, if we're making it up or developing it as we go along, it seems to me that why can't we just leave the source behind? Why does it still have the kind of rhetorical force that it has, and why do people still, why are we celebrating the 250th anniversary of a document that, perhaps ought to be consigned to the dustbin of history?
Honestly, that's what I had to grapple with when I read the topic. But what I came to realize is even though we all have our own opinions of the Declaration of Independence, it holds so much rhetorical power to be able to connect a principle of the founding of our country in the United States, which is the reason why speakers and Supreme Court judges continue to go back to the Declaration time and time again. It would be, I don't want to say dishonest, but it would lack value for us to say that we shouldn't be looking at these historical documents or understanding that there is historical significance that increases legitimacy of a speaker and has rhetorical power. Stating famous speeches, going back to the Constitution, the Declaration has rhetorical power for an argument that needs to be acknowledged. And that's not going to go away, especially because we hold so much pride in the United States for how our country was founded, and we look back to the Revolutionary War and the Declaration. There's a lot of emphasis on those documents, and so I feel like that emphasis needs to be paired with adequate context to understand who's translating the Declaration to us, because it is being translated.
I have one more for all three speakers. And I confess that I was a little taken aback that first three speakers all somehow, well, two of you spoke about immigration, took that as the case, and Nathan went the other way and talked about kicking people out. And so, my question is, how can one conduct a discussion informed by due process, or by the rhetorical force of the Declaration, or by the kind of extreme democracy that inspired ostracism, about how we do or do not manage membership in the community. So I'll leave it to all three of you. Anyone wants to take this, or don't want to take it? Old man, though.
So how could the content of the presentation further guide discussion surrounding community, connectivity, such things? I think a lot of political discourse, as we just saw in the two questions asked, focus on what is and less on maybe what ought to be, right? So we had the question of who should be interpreting the Declaration of Independence. We could have started back further and said just how much should this document inform much of our political life and conversation today. I think what helps in discussing these sorts of fringe activities like the extreme democracy in Athens is that it gets our brains working in ways that seem sort of unique compared to types of conversations that we typically have. Much of our discussion focuses on interpretation, valid interpretation, invalid interpretation. We start from these sorts of presuppositions that this is a document from 1776 that continues to be relevant to us today. And maybe it is, and in large senses I think it is, but that remains a kind of unjustified supposition to the fact that we're celebrating 250 years hence. So I think starting a little bit further back and maybe exploring questions that remain underexplored in existing literature, in classrooms, and civic education provides a way forward to maybe more meaningful political discussion. More normative questions of what ought to be and what should be, taking precedence on maybe more, I don't want to say easier questions, but different questions of what is, I think offer meaningful ways forward. That's what I'd say.
Yeah, and I think in a different way as well. So when we consider our beginnings and we consider a trajectory, because you can certainly draw a trajectory when you go back to the Magna Carta over 800 years ago and look at the process that was applied to foreigners, which was not exactly very nice, especially to the French. And then you go up to today's moment in time, you begin to almost point yourself towards maybe this is the furthering of our citizenship. Maybe if I can point, if I shoot an arrow or I shoot a basketball or something, and I take two pictures of where that is on the arc, I can kind of guess where it will end up. And the idea is that if our tree of due process is growing in the right way, you can kind of imply where it's going. So looking at a bunch of Supreme Court cases, you see like in the 1800s, the United States versus the Amistad, which of course is a slave ship that mutinied. They killed all of the people on board. The slaves killed all the people on board in international waters. They are entered into the United States, arrested. Supreme Court overturns that, and they're entered as free men. So you end up with that. That's certainly a kind of immigration thing that we see through our history. We also see a bunch of other things. I mean, I mentioned the Ignaz Mezai, Cold War. That's not a good thing that happened there. And we see that. And we've worked very hard since then to get past that, get over that. And it's like we can see a bunch of the things that have come against us, especially in, my emphasis on the due process side. In that case, the concurring opinion is one that really emphasized the fact that our government and our Congress gets to decide what due process is, especially when it comes to immigrants. But, as we keep developing as a nation, we start to get away from that idea that necessarily we can decide what due process is. Due process might be something like what the founders were implying, that is universally applicable to all people, regardless of where they're from. And I think that that's the key, that eventually maybe it'll inform our decisions of what ought to be, because we can look and say, well, this is the trajectory. These are the scars that we're healing from now. And it's not hard to look around and see these are the scars of due process. you see a whole bunch of different things, especially in the contemporary moments, like what's happening in Minnesota, and all of these things as scars to our due process of citizenship and all of these things. So considering just from there that that's a scar that will be healed over and strengthened, and wondering, informing our discussion about immigration specifically as, well, what do we do about that now? Because we can't erase that. We ought not erase that. We need to grow around it and grow better from it. And I think that's kind of where that question is. It's about trajectory, looking at what's currently cutting into our promise of due process and resolving those things to grow. I think that's where that answer to the question is.
Okay. I think also another important aspect of that question of why we're looking at the Declaration and these founding documents is also because they hold a lot of legitimacy that I feel like, as we're going through these essays, as we're discussing the Declaration, it's really an interrogation. We're looking back on the evolution of these principles over time. We're looking at their founding and we're interrogating them. We're seeing how they've changed. We're seeing where they should be applied. And I think that's really important, especially when we have, just recently at the beginning of February, a federal judge cited the Declaration in their decision about immigration and cited he has sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people, and it was very rhetorically powerful. And so I think it's really important to go back to these founding documents and interrogate those principles and how they're being used today.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and move to the next set of student presentations, and as I said, I'm proceeding in alphabetical order, and next up in the alphabet is Zach Hamley. That's what they get up there.
More people than I thought. So the prompt that I chose was, has the lack of civic education made Americans, us, incapable of governing ourselves through, in particularly, the principles of the Declaration? The answer is yes. It's that simple. My family has something like an important connection to this topic specifically. I don't claim it because I don't have anything to do with it and I can't take credit for it. But on my mom's side, they immigrated from Italy, and they married into a family that's been here for a long time, which makes me a direct descendant of Josiah Bartlett, who signed the Declaration of Independence. Also, both my parents, which I can't take credit for, are public school teachers. So education is something that's very important to me. The people who were like my aunts and uncles growing up are teachers. So that kind of dialogue you hear as a kid, just like them talking about how education isn't working and what they find problems with and what they wish they could change and are unable to because of, financial reasons or whatever, it just like formed me as a human being. And so, it's impacted the way that I look at the world. And so I chose that for that reason. So the question specifically asked is about civic education, but I'm going to throw that out the window. Not completely, but I like to focus on literacy rates. If you can't read, if you can't comprehend information, you can't really base anything off of that, right? And we do have declining literacy rates. As far as civic education goes, this leads to a misunderstanding of government or a complete lack of understanding of its structure and principles. The Declaration of Independence presents the American people as an engaged civic body, and not just as citizens who are governed by a separate entity. Multiple founding documents, like the Constitution, talks about we the people, right? So it is an engaged civic body. And as a republic or representative democracy, representatives should not be treated as an aristocracy, right? But if education is flawed in some areas and not flawed in other areas, then you create certain people who have access to better education and other people who don't. At which point, you create an educated populace. As my philosophy friend could tell you, that's what an aristocracy is, right? And I'm not calling the United States an aristocracy. I'm I'm also not calling it an authoritarian regime. I'm just saying populism is easier when people are uneducated, and that's a fact. You can look at that anywhere through history, and you can see that in multiple instances in American history. When populism becomes more popular, the people who gravitate to it the most are uneducated. As a certain president said during a campaign trail, I love the poorly educated. If you cannot formulate strong ideas and you cannot articulate them, then you cannot act on them. Therefore, if you do not have a basis of education, then you fail to be able to properly engage in the civic nation that is America, or the United States. At that point, government becomes separate from the people, and it ceases to be self-government. You have an educated populace capable of being the representatives, and people who are incapable of engaging with those representatives, creating a divergence. So I referred to Paul Seaton's book in Public Philosophy and Patriotism. He states, if democracy is to continue, thoughtful citizenship is a requirement for a critical mass of the citizenry. He also quotes Thomas Jefferson, who called the Declaration an expression of the American mind. Excuse me. Seaton identifies 4 characteristics of the Declaration. Logical, liberty-loving, manly, which is interesting, and gesturing towards philosophical and theological reflection. So the first and last concern reason. And Jefferson called it a reflection of the American mind, not the American heart. So if this document prioritizes rational thought, and this takes an epistemological approach, which it does, then liberty is grounded in knowledge. So my paper takes 3 syllogisms. I've paraphrased them. And we'll get into that in a second. And again, my philosophy guy will tell you, and Plato in the Republic argues that reason is the highest part of the soul. Reason must govern the appetites. So without rule by reason, governance becomes rule by desire, which is obviously what we're trying to avoid. So for the first argument I make, if we've established, which we have, that reason is required for liberty because you cannot engage with the government you don't understand, and education cultivates reason, therefore, education is required for liberty. So a population without a strong foundational education is in danger of losing liberty that they have. Seaton secondarily argues, this is a little bit out of order, but I'm going in the order that he wrote about it in. And then he argues that emotion may spark revolution, but reason establishes its principles. He says that revolution requires articulation of principles, discernment of relevant facts, inferring causes from effects, and connecting ends and means. So a revolution not grounded in reason collapses or becomes incoherent. So we've established that you cannot maintain liberty without education, but you can also not gain liberty without education. So I'm not reserved to a violent revolution. If you look at protests and peaceful gatherings, without guiding principles, they collapse or become incoherent and unusable, at which point furthering liberty cannot be done without reason, which education creates that or cultivates that. So a complacent people lack self-government. So educational decline also affects everyone. So far I've focused on the people almost as a separate body than the government, but this also affects potential representatives, people who may run. Those who run for office are products of the same system. Leaders without reason are dangerous, as Plato talked about. Seaton again references Jefferson. The Declaration warns us against abuses and usurpations, designs towards absolute despotism. The people hold the government accountable, but the people also are the government. Therefore, the government holds itself accountable, supposedly. This requires self-awareness, rational judgment, and thoughtfulness. Without education, politicians become intellectually and morally weak, which they are. I mean, I don't want to call anybody out, but Obama's a war criminal. So democracy destabilizes. You have a sitting president call for the dissolution of the Department of Education. So I'm not arguing for or against centralization. I'm simply pointing out that inconsistent standards produce inconsistent education. This is not an argument for Common Core. This is a statement of fact. So, returning to Trump's remark about loving the poorly educated, it could potentially be division over education, or it could be, you know, if we're being generous, it could be like, hey, he wants to uplift these people. Take whatever position you want. But the nation's report card in 2025 showed continued declines in reading and literacy rates. Some minor math improvement, but overall downward trend. I don't have the exact statistics in front of me. I will have the reference to those later. Again, you cannot engage politically in what you don't understand. So to understand the Declaration, you must read it or be taught its meaning. So either you must have the tools to educate yourself, which requires a fundamental education in the first place, or you must receive that through an educational institution. Both require education. So then if you have people who don't necessarily need the flawed educational system that we have, and have people around them who can uplift them and teach them what they need, then you are having people who operate outside of the educational institution, which is whatever. But it creates, it's a difference, right? These people don't need it, and these people, all they have are the education institution, right? And so that creates the potential aristocracy that I was talking about earlier. So if education is the foundation of democracy, the United States is a democracy. Therefore, if education declines, democracy declines, and the United States declines. When education struggles, democracy suffers. Capacity and information are both capacity to understand information and the information afterwards are both provided by some form of education. A system that does not have that is a system struggling to produce democracy. In my opinion, it's that simple. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Next up, Dr. McKenzie, Oglethorpe.
Hello, I'm Morgan. I'm a second-year politics major at Oglethorpe University, and today I'm going to talk about Seaton's views about misconceptions about the Declaration of Independence. Specifically from the same book that Zach talked about, the Public Philosophy and Patriotism Essays on the Declaration of U.S. and Us Today. And I'm also going to touch on the importance of reading it with attention to explicit words and claims to better understand the Declaration of Independence. So many critics of the Declaration today believe that it's hypocritical, racist, and involves ideological apologists due to the Founding Fathers and the world that they lived in. These critics fail to read the Declaration fully and better understand it in a different lens. So a great quote from Paul Seaton's book states, Americans could sit down and reread it with due attention, consider its explicit words and claims, as well as the concepts and arguments they convey. Encountering what it explicitly says, they could speculate about its missing premises and arguments. Seaton saying in this argument that we need to reevaluate the Declaration of Independence and look at it in a clearer lens. There's also hypercritical allegations and allegations of the Founding Fathers as hypocrites from many critics of the Declaration of Independence. However, according to Seaton, the writers' reference to God in their writings combat the hypocritical and hypocrisy allegations. He believes that the Founding Fathers looked to God for what human political leadership could aspire to be, looking at a higher power, like a perfect power. Specifically, whether it be legislating, executing, or judging. The writers' end goal, what they're trying to achieve, is guard against tyranny, specifically the tyranny that they saw in the UK with the English monarchy. Because aristocratic families were controlling the Declaration, well, not the Declaration, but they were controlling the government at the time. And so there were social classes of aristocratic families that were in charge. And not every person, not every man was equal of different social classes. There were also racist allegations made against the Declaration of Independence. Seaton believes the critics' allegations of racism are made without reading the broader context of the Declaration. The writers focus more on individuals than a specific race of people. Race, sex, and gender are largely abstracted from the Declaration to not stir arguments in government. And by the writers doing this is their way to modernize and allow the government to modernize over time. So next I'm going to talk about ideological apologetics allegations against the Declaration. Seaton uses the interpretive principle to better understand the context of the Declaration's quote of all men are created equal. Seaton states, the Declaration is not a theoretical document. The lines, therefore, need to be taken contextually in a more practical or active manner, and not simply as a statement of fact or belief. To wrap up, in conclusion, the critics of the Declaration fail to read the Declaration fully in order to evaluate it efficiently. Context and importance of individuals should be reevaluated. To the Founding Fathers, reiterates their motives to produce a United States of America with many individuals making up the whole body. And I want to leave you guys with a quote from Seaton. Following an old interpreted principle, they need to be read in the light of the nature and purpose of the document as a whole. This allows us to see new dimensions and meaning in the familiar words, dimensions of which we are in particular need of today in our society. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Makaela Williams. I'm a senior philosophy major here, and I'm going to talk about the lack of civic education in America. When we were first told that this would be happening and given the prompts, I kind of struggled on what I wanted to do it on. But I decided on this one because I feel like in order to talk about this topic, period, you have to be educated on it. Like, you can come up here and try, but if you don't have any facts or anything to back it up, then you can't even really give valid arguments. So the question is, does the Declaration still guide our political life? It does, but only if you're educated on the Declaration specifically, but of course you still need education to do so. And with the Declaration, it is assumed that everybody is educated. It is assumed that everybody is able to read it, understand it, comprehend it, judge it, and debate it just as we're doing today. Today, civic education is very inconsistent or also absent in some states as well. It's not required to be taught everywhere. Therefore, a lot of people have not even read the full Declaration. A lot of people may only know "we the people," if they even know that part. A lot of college students haven't even read the full Declaration. I'm going to assume that everybody has read it, just as the Declaration does, but the truth is not everybody has read it. It's very inconsistent. I decided to ask my sister, what does she know about it? She said that she couldn't tell me, and that if I had asked her last year, she could have gave me more information because they went over it last year. That just shows that the school system at this point only cares for test scores. They want you to memorize it and not actually learn it. I asked her, okay, what about the Constitution? What rights do you know? She said right to bear arms, right for women to vote, and freedom of speech. I'm from Memphis, Tennessee. I had somebody from Georgia. They gave me the same exact answer, word for word. That was it. My experiences with it, I had to take a civic education class. They pretty much only taught us about gender marrying. I hope I said that right. that was pretty much all we learned. The only reason that I was able to get actual education on the Declaration is because my school had offered a law class, which pretty much went over the first year of what law school would be like. My school happened to be the only school that even offered that class in an entire city. That also just goes to show again how it is very inconsistent, because not everybody was even offered that opportunity to take that course to learn more about our politics here. Without people knowing anything, they can't argue about it. Some may want to say, oh, they don't like this, they're discriminating, we're living in a tyranny. But can you really distinguish that if you never learned what a tyranny is? Can you distinguish that if you never even learned what the Declaration considers a tyranny? You might just not like it, but it's not actually tyranny. That's just what you're calling it. Because you never learned about it, you won't even be able to tell us what real injustice is. You wouldn't recognize it. You wouldn't be able to give us the facts on why it is injustice. If people aren't educated, then the judgment that is being given it becomes unequal. Only some of us can give it. You can only go based on what you've been told, and that's another thing. Some people be like, oh, you can go into the media, you can figure it out on your own. Can you really? The media is controlled. They're going to show you what they want to show. I remember something, nothing to do with this topic specifically, but my math teacher told us, if you're not really educated on what something is, and I tell you that 2 + 2 is 5, how can you tell me I'm wrong? You weren't taught how to tell me that I am wrong. You weren't taught to show the facts on why 2 + 2 is not 5. So again, you have to be educated. You have to read it. You have to comprehend it. You have to be able to understand it in order to actually have that argument on it. And the schools aren't teaching us that anymore. So at this point, people really wouldn't be able to govern themselves. They'd have to rely on somebody else and hope that they're teaching them what's actually right. So the Declaration, yes, it's still important. Yes, it serves as a guide, but at this point, it's kind of guided on base what you're being told and not on what a lot of people actually know and are able to comprehend and tell us if they're wrong or if they're right. So that is all I have for today. Thank you.
Okay, Natalie, we go from left to right. Goes next.
Can I move this over to...
Hi everyone, I am also talking about civic education today, mainly the fact that it's in a deplorable state. It desperately needs improvement. But why does it need to be improved? Why are we having this conversation about civic education improvement? Well, civic education creates good citizens. But what is a good citizen? On surface level, from the American perspective, it's upholding the law, it's following the law, it's doing our jury duty even though most of us hate it. It's all of that, but there's something else about the Declaration of Independence. In it, we recognize that people have unalienable rights, but that's not just Americans. That's the entire world. We recognize good citizenship as following those rights, of not violating those rights. Let's go back to Nazi Germany. We wouldn't consider that good citizenship. No matter what Hitler would have thought, that's violating people's rights. And then another reason that we need to know about civic education. We are the only government in the world with a social contract. The founding fathers were influenced by the Enlightenment period, mainly John Locke. He's the life, liberty, and property guy. That turns into life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But he had the idea of a social contract where the people give up some authority to the government to govern us, to better us, to work for us, unlike the monarchy. And the Declaration outlines that we have this social contract. The Constitution sets the terms of the contract. But if people don't know the Declaration, how do they even know they're part of this contract to begin with? How do we know that when the government starts working against us for an extended period of time of trying to become tyrannical and then won't stop when we say no, that we have the right to form a new government? How do we know? Next slide. This is not the first time it's been brought up with civic education. All the way back on January 27th, 1838, Abraham Lincoln, at 28 years old, gave a speech to the Young Men's Lyceum in Springfield, Illinois. And in it, he opened up with, America cannot be destroyed by an abroad threat. America has to be destroyed from the inside. And considering what he would lead us through, that's strangely prophetic. But for this situation, he brought up mob rule. During that time in the United States, all across the country, there was mob rule. People were killing other people because they thought they violated the law. For instance, there were gamblers who were legally gambling. The legislation had been passed the year before, but there were people who believed it illegal. So they killed them for it. And that was happening in some variation all across the states. And Abraham Lincoln said this as the solution: let reverence for the law be breathed by every American mother to the lisping babe that prattles in her lap. Let it be taught in schools, in seminaries, and in colleges. Let it be written in primers, spelling books, and almanacs. Let it be preached from the pulpit, proclaimed in legislative halls, and enforced in the halls of justice. He wanted it taught everywhere. That people, if they knew the law, they would stop doing this, or at least hopefully stop doing this. And then 4 years later, Horace Mann, July 4th in Boston, his oration, he talks a lot about civic education and what we Americans are supposed to do, and mainly with voting. He expressed love of seeing so many people voting, but he hated that it was swept up through partisan politics. That people, he called them imbeciles, who would rise from drunken states and vote for parties, not really understanding what in the world they were voting for. In describing the state of the nation with this type of elections, he said its various parts are only just clinging together, and unless therefore a new substructure can be placed beneath every buttress and angle of this boasted temple of liberty, it will soon totter and fall and bury all indwellers in ruins. He believed in civic education. He wanted it taught to kids, to high schoolers, because the next generation is always the future. And he was the head of the common school movement, which would eventually create public schools across the nation with civic education at their core. They were meant to teach civics. And yet, look at this. That should have solved the problem if common schools were built on civics. But what happened? Look at this deficit here. What is the current civics knowledge of Americans? In a survey, 50% know the year of independence. When I first read that, I went, oh, that's a majority. And then my second thought was, that's a horrible majority, y'all. That should be 100%. Saying for 76% of people know who the revolution was against. These should be no-brainer questions. In a different, more recent survey of 2,000 people, over 70% failed a basic literacy quiz about how many branches of government we have. And it's like, if y'all don't know this, if y'all don't know what year we declared independence, how in the world do y'all know about the social contract that we have? You don't. Well, what happened? What happened between the common schools and what we have now? Well, the Cold War happened, and during the latter half of the Cold War, we were competing so much with the Soviet Union of math and science and engineering, and those are all important things, but we forgot to teach Americans how to be Americans, how to know their civics, how to know their government. And since then, education has not yet recovered in decades. There have been some attempts at improvement. Let's take Alabama, for example, my great state. And yet, 1.5 million was allotted for an online course in civics that all grade levels can use. This was modeled off of Florida's 2021 system. It didn't go through. It was meant to create an online course for teachers to learn. And that's a great step, and it shows they're talking about it. It still fell through, but it does show that it's an important issue. Then we also have the Educating for American Democracy project, with the goal to increase civic learning in schools. They have a desire for, in their own words, strengthening history and civic learning, and to ensure that civic learning opportunities are delivered equitably throughout the country. It's hope for the youth, but this project isn't only for the youth. It was for students, but it was also for teachers and politicians and authors. And they are trying to reach a benchmark that we are not setting in the United States. In conclusion, what is the treatment for a lack of civic education? How do we reverse decades of regressing civic literacy? Well, the online programs and talking about it, that's a start. But that's optional. We should be like Horace Mann and putting civic education in elementary school. Teaching people from diapers what it means to have civic education, to know about your government, to be an American. And it's just, I am scared for the next generation and every generation that goes after that if we follow this trend of declining civic literacy. Because how do you uphold the documents this country is built on if you do not know the foundation? We have to fix it now, not later, now. Thank you.